Assalamu alaikum. This is Layla Abdullah-Poulos, and welcome to NbA Authors Speak. You get to watch me review the books. Now is my opportunity to talk with the authors so readers can get to know them better. And the author that has graced us with his presence today is Ahmad Mubarak. Mubarak describes himself as a lifelong student of Islamic sciences. He has studied Islam traditionally at Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt, and also studied in Syria, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Mubarak holds a BA in Arabic Studies from DePaul University and is currently finishing his master's at DePaul University. Then I don't know how you have a minute to talk to me, but okay. I'm grateful that you did. The topic of his perspectives is an introduction of Afro-Arabic literature, Quranic exegesis, and Sufi literature by Sheikh al-Islam Ibrahim Niasse. And his book is Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims. And I have to have your book here next to me. Because it is so dynamic and it is so interesting. I keep finding myself, I got my markers and everything. I keep finding myself going back to this because as a Black Muslim and as an African-American Muslim, someone that has a background that has been cut off from the rich Islamic heritage that occurred overseas, I find work like yours and other Black Muslim scholarship like life's breath. Because there's so much alienation that I've been made to feel and foreignness that I've been made to feel when it comes to being Muslim and being Black and being someone that is from a background that I'm very proud of. I mean, African-American heritage is an extremely vibrant and profound background, but still just that foreignness and that alienation. And one of the interesting things that I always find is that this is not something new. This is not this whole idea of Afro-Arab literature. This is not a new thing that is just happening in this century.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد فاتح لما أغلق وخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق الهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقداره عظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'm very pleased and honored to be here and share this platform with you. Speaking about my book that I co-authored with Imam Dawood Wadi. In regards to what we're talking about, Arabness and Blackness and how the two aren't mutually exclusive, what a lot of people, particularly Westerners and even Arabs for the most part, if they're not like very educated, what a lot of people don't understand is that this within Arabic literature, there's an entire genre basically dedicated to Arab Blackness, right? So what do we mean by Arab Blackness? The first book that was probably dedicated to this topic was written in the 3rd century by a Black Arab scholar by the name of Al-Jahiz. He wrote a book called Fakhr al-Sawdan al-Baydan, roughly translates to the victory of the Blacks over the whites. He was and he wrote this book, he said, to address a lot of the anti-Blackness which he saw permeating within the Islamic and Arab polity, right? And in this book, he outlined, he gave a brief history of Arabness and Blackness and how many of the tribes of, Central Arabia, like Bani Sulaim and others, were in fact Black. Not only were they Black, but they bragged about their Blackness. Like this was something which they had fakhr, they had pride in. And he attributed a lot of the anti-Blackness which began to creep into the society. He attributed to the expansion of the Arab and or Muslim empire, being that Black Arabs themselves considered themselves Black. And this may seem, strange to a lot of people, but we can look no further than, for example, there's hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he's describing Arabs and he's describing them as black people, according to many of the classical mufassirin and hadith scholars. For example, there's the famous hadith which we all know, where the Prophet ﷺ said that there's no superiority, the black has no superiority over the white, nor the white over the black. The Arab has no superiority over the non-Arab. When we actually read the commentary to this hadith, Imam Nawawi or Qadi Iyad, he says that what's meant here by black, he said, is the Arabs. He said because most of their colors are black. He said, and what's meant here by the white or the red, and actually in the Arabic is actually, there's one narration that says white, but most of them say red. The one in Sahih Muslim, he said red. He said what's meant by red, he's speaking about the non-Arabs, right? And so Al-Jahiz, he compiles all of these, textual proofs and everything in this book to address this subject, right? So this isn't a case of like, Ahmad Mubarak being a social justice warrior in, 2016 or 2017 and trying to, do some sort of eisegesis.
Blacking up the Arab bloodline.
Right. I didn't make this up, right? So that, if a person has a problem with it, you could like take that up with Al-Jahiz and Qadi Iyad, those people. But not only that, we see that this was a common theme over centuries. So, for example, later on, the famous Hanbali scholar Ibn Jawzi, which we depended on a lot of the profiles we use in the book. He wrote a book called Tanwir al-Ghabish fi Akhbar al-Habish, and the story behind how Imam Ibn Jawzi, wrote this book is very telling. So Ibn Jawzi himself says that he was in the street and he saw a black man who was basically on the side of the curb, loathing himself, very melancholy. And so Ibn Jawzi, he asked, what's the matter with you? How can I help? And the man says, Allah has cursed me. And he inquires why. He said, well, because I'm black. Right. So we see even early on, and this is important because this can be an issue of aqidah. This could affect a person's relationship with Allah. And so Ibn Jawzi, basically, he becomes infuriated, and he asks the man, who told you this? Where did you get this from? And he says, well, it's evident in the way we're treated. And so Ibn Jawzi goes home and he writes this book, basically outlining, giving biographies of hundreds of early black personalities in Islamic history, from amongst the Sahaba, even from amongst prior to the Sahaba, a lot of the nobles of the Quraysh prior to Islam, right? And it doesn't stop there. A couple centuries later, Imam Suyuti, and he's in Egypt now. He writes no less than 4 books dedicated to this topic. One of my favorite ones is a book he has called Rafa Lisan al-Habshan fi Luqat al-Quran. It's called The Elevation, or Raising the Elevation of the Ethiopian Tongue Through the Language of the Quran. And in this book, Imam Suyuti extrapolates all of the vocabulary in the Quran in Arabic, which actually are Ethiopian words, or they have Ethiopian origins. Proving what? The Arabic itself is an Afro-Asiatic language, right? So, this is Imam Suyuti, the famous author of Tafsir Jalalain, the Tafsir of the Two Jalals, which is a very famous tafsir. He basically commentated on every single hadith collection within the Sunni tradition. He reached such a level of scholarship that he claimed ijtihad, that he was a mujtahid mutlaq, that he was able to, directly go to the Quran and to the Sunnah and extrapolate rulings, which this particular level of scholarship is only reserved for the likes of people like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad Mubarak. So this genre dealing with Arabness and blackness is nothing new.
Yeah.
It's new to us in the West, you know, probably because a lot of us don't have access to the text, but it's there. So we didn't come up with anything new. We're just basically bringing out what was already there and making it available.
I find that kind of interesting because as a historian, one of the things I homeschool my children, and one of the things I just had a conversation started up on Facebook about global history
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea of the compartmentalization of Afro-Arab history. So when
Mm-hmm.
you look at, like, say that you start with the ancient societies and cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and even before, prior to the Europeans and the Greco-Roman societies kind of coming in, there was so much interaction and so much fluidity
Mm-hmm.
these historical societies that kind of gets cut off in,
Mm-hmm.
in modern history. You know, you have this whole idea of like one of the things that you approach in your book, which is like this de-Africanization of the
Mm-hmm.
Arabian Peninsula, and you actually you cite Ali Mazrui, which I remember him talking about this. Like I saw a lecture of his, and he was talking about this about when they cut off when they built the Suez Canal, how they cut off the Arabian Peninsula. So it was no longer Africa or African or Black. And so the exchange of languages that you found, the
Mm-hmm.
interaction of the way that Arabs actually describe themselves, the Prophet Islam and before, did not have this alienation of Arabness from Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
When did this kind of like set off? I mean, I know we like to think of, you know, like in a colonial context, where the Europeans came in and they decided to relegate people and say you're this and you're that, which definitely happened. But given that these works, that this extent that these works that have occurred through history were necessary, like Ibn
Mm-hmm.
Jawzi, that they were necessary, is there some complicitness of anti-blackness and alienation of blackness from Arabness by Arab society itself?
Uh, yes, I would say that this didn't happen overnight, right? So going back to Jahiz, we're talking about third century. He begins to see this shift then. And so he attributed initially, like I said, to as the Arab and Muslim state expanded, you more and more people were coming into the polity, more people who were what? Not black. And as a result of which, he said that for things like European features became more valued because it was exotic. So dark skin, dark hair, thick lips, and everything. Okay, we know about this, right? This, you know. So basically, there's sort of like a fetishization going on
Okay.
of non-black features. We also have to understand that okay, there's three different types of Arabs. So when we talk about Arabs, it's not like a monolith, right? So traditionally, there's three different types of Arabs. You have Arab al-Bad, and Musta'arab, right? So you have the ancient Arabs, which are like the tribes of Ad and Thamud, which are no longer present. They're extinct. Then you have like the Arab, which are the pure ethnic Arabs are basically the southern Yemenis, and they branch into two different sub branches, the Adnanis and the Qahtanis. The Qahtanis are the true ethnic Arabs. Everyone else we see, whether they're Egyptian, whether they're Libyan, whether they're Moroccan, whether they're Syrian, Jordan, all of these people are what we consider Musta'arab. These are Arabized Arabs. These are what? People who became Arab as a result of taking on the language and the culture. So we can see over centuries of all of these people entering into Arabness, they basically became the face of Arabness. When I was in Syria, um, uh, we were one of my teachers. I remember him telling us that, for example, Syria just became majority Muslim within the past like 500 years, despite the fact that it was opened up, very early on, right? And we know this because the Syrian scholars and everything, they trace the rate of conversion by the change of the names. So people had non-Arab names first, and as they would become Muslim, they would adopt Arabic names. And so that's how they were able to trace the rate of conversion. And Syria itself only became a majority Muslim country within the past 500 years.
Wow.
Despite the fact that it's been under Muslim control for 1400 plus years, right? So it was a gradual process. And then with that, and then bring in, European, colonialization within the past, a couple hundred years and everything. And basically everything is just exacerbated. And so, you can't have this paradigm of white supremacy. Blacks never contributed to anything. They don't have any literate civilization when you have like, this entire, peninsula of black people here who produced, one of
Yeah, but they're saying that they weren't black, and you have there seems to be an extreme allergy by so many Arabs, and I'm saying it plainly, against having any kind of melanin past a certain point. And I think that modern white supremacy and it may have played a role in that, but it's not something that existed.
No, no. So what I would say is that it exacerbated the situation.
Okay.
I would say that it exacerbated the situation. Um, but like I said, it was a gradual process over years and years and years. I mean, now let's look back. The Arabs themselves were, they became the subjects of the people they conquered, right? So when we look at Seljuk history and things like that, the Abbasid, caliphs were basically just puppets for the Seljuks and things like this. And so the Arabs had long lost dominance within their own empire, right? So you had the rise of the Persians, you had the rise of the Turks, you had the rise of, all of these different, ethnic groups. And, Arabness was sort of relegated. It kept its status basically as a language and as a culture. But a lot of the integrals which were part of the culture in the past, those things basically became lost over the years.
Okay. So there was it's complex. So this whole idea of anti-blackness in an Arab context is complex because blackness is complex in an Arab context, and which wouldn't concern me if I wasn't Muslim because I'm not an Arab. Because I'm Muslim, I find it concerning because I think that it leaks over into Muslim culture, Muslim scholarship. I just had my last interview was with Habiba Kande, and one of his books on sensuality and sexuality, sexual errors in Islam. One of the things that I pointed out was that a lot of the text from these scholars was very misogynistic and against black women. So there's a lot of misogyny that existed. And so when I'm listening to you and this whole idea of developing a fetish for the exotic and the foreign, because to as the Arab culture became empirical, as the Muslim Arab culture became empirical, and broadened out into these other societies, they started fetishizing over the exoticness of these women, and so maybe that can explain some of it.
I'll give you an example. If you look at the Ottoman caliphs, right? Every single last one of their mothers were European concubines for 500 years. Every single last one, right?
And they used to Christian women and
right. Like you said, and that does pour over now. I mean, subhanallah, I remember I was like 19, man, in Cairo, and we were reading fiqh. And one of my friends, he said, you know, some of these texts you read, it'll like, it's not good that you read it until, you know, you have a very firm grasp of all of the texts, basically, as well as like strong iman. I said, why? He said, you're gonna read the Bab of nikah. He said, and it's gonna make you hate fiqh. And I said,
Why?
why is that? He said, well, you know, you'll read stuff like in regards to the chapter on the suitability of marriage, you know, it's preferred, you know, to, you know, black women, you know, they're like the lowest on what's desirable. Um, Above the black women are the Qibtis, like the Egyptian Coptics, and above them are the Israeli women, the Israelite women, and above them are like the Arab women, meaning like the Levantine Arab women. And so they actually, in some of these books, categorize what woman was more suitable, basically based upon her skin color. And this is in fiqh books.
That is so symbolically violent. And so,
Yes.
how does one who is of this lower echelon that they've placed blackness in, how is a Muslim who is trying to develop their scholarship and their faith, you know, because I think it's very demoralizing. How do they come to terms when there's all of this text that is so aggressive and violent towards their skin color, which is an ayat of Allah? So why is it that you're putting these negative connotations on an ayat of Allah? And then how does one continue, like you said, how do you want to continue your scholarship if you go in and it's just like all of this that exists? Not that it doesn't exist in other religions, because if you go into a lot of Christian exegesis texts, and they're just as bad, but in a Muslim context, how do you forge ahead?
A lot of the
Scholarship that you respect has had these colorist, I won't say racist, I'll just say colorist tendencies.
no, so we have to understand too, right? So a lot of these attitudes the Muslims borrow actually from the Christians.
Okay.
I'm just gonna say that they a lot of these so-called, you know, the text they base these issues of desirability and things upon, you know, they're actually based on like fabricated hadith demeaning black people. So that's what. So one of the Ibn Jawzi says in his book, he said, look, every time you see a hadith demeaning black people, know that it's fabricated.
Mm.
The Prophet ﷺ never said this, right? And so the Muslims are actually learning these things from the Christians, right? An example of this would be so Morocco invades Timbuktu in 1591 under this is when Ahmed Mansour al-Sa'adi was the Sultan of Morocco. So Morocco, so first they send some letters to Songhai, which was the predominant empire in West Africa at the time, in sub-Saharan Africa, which was a Muslim empire, which was independent, which basically from the time of the Abbasid caliphs, they had been recognized as independent and had basically their own caliphate. So Ahmed Mansour Morocco, he sends a letter to Songhai, and basically he's telling them to give up their independence and pledge fealty to him in Morocco. The king of Songhai, his name was Askia Dawood. At the time, he replies back. He says no, and he lays out all his evidence. You know, we're an independent, you know, Muslim people. You know, our independence has been recognized from, you know, the time of Askia Muhammad and all of this and that. You know, basically, no, thank you. Morocco sends an army, a mercenary army of mainly Portuguese to Timbuktu to conquer Timbuktu. They brought back many of the scholars to Morocco. One of the scholars was a man named Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba. And so Ahmed Baba, he goes into and he debates Ahmed Mansour on why or the illegality of attacking Shanghai. And he says, look, we're a Muslim people. This war is totally illegal. You know, we're not transgressors and this. So Ahmad Mubarak says, well, we still have, you know, a legal cause to fight you because you're black. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the blacks will be the slaves of basically of the sons of Shem and Ham. I mean of Japheth. So basically, he in the form of a hadith, he reiterates the cursed sons of Ham theory. So Ahmed Baba, you know, he becomes infuriated and he actually writes a book refuting this. It's called Miraj al-Sud, where he totally, you know, academically destroys this, you know, argument that blacks are somehow inherently inferior and worthy of being slaves.
So, okay, so now this brings me to the next point that I kind of wanted to talk to you about, and that you mentioned in your book about Arabness and blackness. Arabness and blackness were not mutually exclusive in early Islamic history. By blackness in this context is not an identity which has been framed as inferior compared to whiteness, but relating to physical traits.
Mm.
So this whole idea of conflating blackness to inferiority and whiteness to superiority. So this binary, it existed before the Europeans came in. You're saying it was influenced by Christian influence, but before the colonization of Northern Africa, did this exist? And what were you're saying that they quoted hadith?
Fabricated.
Okay, for fabricated hadith. Fabricated hadith. But someone wrote those lies, and what motivated someone to write those lies to kind of jam this diluted white superiority and black inferiority into an into a Muslim context? There's nothing Islamic about it, but into a Muslim context to justify the suppression of people based on skin color. Like, where did that? What motivated Muslims to do that?
You know, like you sort of like answer the question, like to justify their wrongdoing, right? So I can't, as a God conscious, you know, Muslim, you know, validate that Islamically. So, you know, I'll just make up something to, you know, basically ease my conscience, right? And we find this not only in regards to this, but I mean, so many issues. The history of hadith fabrication is it's very quirky, and you know, when you study it, like you really delve into like the psyche of human beings. Like people will use anything, especially religion, you know, to validate, you know, their wrongdoing and everything. I mean, you have Muslims who there's an entire genre of hadith, fabricated hadith foods, right? So merchants basically would fabricate hadith. You know, if someone was selling tomatoes, oh, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you eat tomatoes, you'll go to Jannah. I'm not making this up. Like there's a book on the virtues of watermelon, of all things.
I have a book, The Medicine of the Prophet. Are you telling me we need to kind of like review and rethink some of the stuff that's in there? What about the Black Seed one? Because that's a really popular one.
But Black Seed, that's actually authentic. But like, but like you had so I mean, this happened so much, and this happened basically in Baghdad. So basically, a bunch of like merchants in Baghdad who were selling produce fabricated a bunch of hadith about the virtues of every single food you could think about.
Got milk type of thing, like a got milk type of thing.
Yeah. So much so
because the Prophet said you needed it. Okay, so I'm not going to go deep into it, but I can't in all good consciousness not ask this question. Okay, so we have these fabricated hadith about color. And the inferiority of blackness, and even like on a lower level food. What about fabricated hadith about the control and suppression of based on gender?
I mean, you have the same thing. This is what I was gonna say about the hadith studies. I think it's very telling that out of all of, so we have a list of like these hadith narrators who were known liars. Muhammad bin Saleh, you know, these sort of people. Not one of the people who were accused of fabricating hadith were women.
Mm.
Women narrators to the muhaddithin are, they're all upright.
Okay. Okay.
No, if you look in
That
all of
doesn't
the,
really answer my question.
no, I'm going there. So I want to be careful
Okay.
and not try to again take one paradigm and place it where it shouldn't be. A lot of the when we talk about, I'll give you an example of some hadiths maybe people use, which they may say, oh, this is misogynistic or something like this, but it's really about a case of interpretation of how you look at it, right? So there's a hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that most of the women in, of hellfire, or most of the inhabitants of the hellfire will be women,
Mm-hmm.
right? So people, so and then he says, because one of the traits they have is that some of them, a lot of them are ungrateful, like to their husbands. Their husband will do something, they'll make one mistake, and then they'll say, "Oh, you were never any good," or this or that,
Never.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so one may outwardly look at this and say, "Okay, oh wow, this is women are just bad," and
How those pits are? You see how those women are?
yeah. Okay, but another way of looking at this is that there are more women in the world. So if there are more women in the world numerically, you know, maybe that's a possible explanation on why there'll be more women in the hellfire. You understand what I'm saying? Um, in regards to other issues, I would need like more specifics and everything, so I can probably address those particular hadith and everything.
Mhm.
But I'm not in no way doubting that you didn't have this same dynamic going on with men wanting to control women, and you know, I'm not doubting it.
Well, I definitely think that the context the context of Quran and Hadith and the way that scholarship and especially lay people kind of utilize it to foster a certain agenda is something that has always happened and that continues to happen.
Mhm.
And I just think that when when it comes to women in particular, the thing that bothers me more so than whether there are hadith that are fabricated or not, or but even the ayat in the Quran and the hadith that specifically address women.
Mhm.
Muslim female scholarship is not allowed. Well, there's a lot of gatekeeping where, for some reason, any kind of exegesis or interpretation, it has to be done for some reason through a male, which I find totally incredulous and incredible, especially since we know that gender is not a human flaw. Okay, it's an ayat of Allah, and it doesn't inherently mean that that you have less intelligence or less perspective or less objectivity and or more. Okay, so just by virtue of the fact that you mentioned that out of all the people that were known for lying about the Prophet ﷺ, that they made a list. Okay, there's a whole list like watch out for this person, that there's not a woman. So why is it this whole idea of discrediting Muslim female scholarship, especially when they're talking about ayat and a hadith that address their gender? So I just that's one of the things that I find particularly incredible, and I just hope that that kind of opens up more because it's a
I think I think a lot of that is cultural, and I'll tell you why. Because again, if we look at Islamic history, traditionally, you had women authorities on these subjects who wrote on these subjects, who expounded on these subjects. Um, with that being said, I, I'll give you an example, and this is not only just in regards to just women issues, but like you mentioned, brother Kende, like in regards to sexuality. Like I'm not making this up. Actually, one of my professors at DePaul, she's actually a Baha'i, she pointed out that a lot of the what we consider like norms, Islamic norms in regards to women's sexuality and things, and what's acceptable or not, are actually like the result of Muslims coming in contact with non-Muslims post Reformation. Because within like Arabic literature, like before then, like a lot of this stuff can get sort of explicit. Muslims were writing about love, um, how to treat women.
Mm-hmm.
Like read Ibn Hazm. You know, uh, he wrote a manual on love, on how to love women, how to approach women and things like this. Again, a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's there. It's just for us to uncover in the West, and I think that us Muslims in the West, we have a great opportunity here because we're not barred down by a lot of those cultural norms which affect a lot of other Muslim majority cultures. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So just like this whole idea, and kind of bring it back for a second to the African American Muslim, because uh,
at the same time, we have to be careful now, again, to not just, make up things just for the sake of,
yeah,
um, I'm a woman, or put in any label, black man, this or that, or this or that, and so therefore, I think this means this. The
yeah,
thing with Islam is that we do have Senate. We do have this tradition of Senate, basically of people handing now not only the text but an understanding of the text. And so, like Abdullah Mubarak, he said, "Olali Senate, call an ass mensha masha." He said, if it wasn't for this, he said, this science that we have of Senate, of
mm-hmm.
taking this knowledge from an unbroken chain from person to person. He said the people would have said whatever they wanted.
Well, they do say whatever they want. What if?
But the science of Senate checks that.
Yeah. Okay.
People have said, yeah, all sorts of crazy things, but we always had that buffer, so to speak.
But do you think that science has a as broad an influence as the other stuff? Because it seems to me like that science is very specific and valued, but not as accessible. So do you think that this science exists, but the majority of Muslims are not going to have access to it, and so you end up with this filter, and depending on who's the one controlling that filter, you'll end up with a lot of stuff that can be attack your personhood for a variety of different in a variety of different ways. And I don't want to name any names or anything like that. I mean, just recently there's been some pushback by some Muslim scholarship here in the U.S. against social justice language and anti-racist language. And so now we have people who are, fighting against a lot of different forms of discrimination and hate, who are now being attacked from another side by scholarship, by people who have read and studied this stuff, and saying you're wrong for wanting to end white supremacy in the society, or speak out against white supremacy, and you should favor your oppressors over yourself. I mean, it may sound incredible, but this is what's happening. So now you have this scholarship that's serving as a filter to justify a whole lot of stuff that you inherently know as a Muslim, because Allah is al-Adl, the Prophet ﷺ was not a racist, and he did not tolerate the degradation of any people based on period. So what do you do now? So those were the people that had access to the science, and you don't have access to the science. But
So
they're telling you this stuff, you're just like, huh?
my solution is do the same thing they did, and equip oneself with the necessary knowledge, to combat that.
That takes years of study and dedication. If you're someone that is raising 6 children, okay, or 1 child, and or not everyone has that ability to do that. So
Step by step.
Step by step.
Step
It's
by
never,
step.
yeah, it's
No,
not
no, 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 no one said it's going to be easy.
it's not an ending thing, and you do have access to stuff. You do have access to things, but some of it you don't.
And or like you said, tap into those scholars, and those resources. Again, not everything is a monolith. Like, just like you got people who are saying this, extreme whatever, you got people in the middle and people who are saying the opposite.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we have to become Islamically literate. What I mean by Islamic literate, I mean, not everyone is not going to be a scholar. Fine, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But I think that Muslims should have some level of Islamic literacy.
Okay. Yeah.
What I mean by Islamic literacy, I mean, for example, you just talked about, when you hear a lot of these things, you inherently know that this is not correct, right? Because Allah, He has certain attributes. Allah is just, Allah doesn't like oppression. He's not, so these are things which you intrinsically know, right? And this is a result of what? Just being Islamically literate. You don't have to be a scholar to know that. You understand what I'm saying? So we should, do whatever we can to raise and heighten the level of Islamic literacy amongst the laity. It's not a zero-sum game. We don't have a clergy, so to speak, in Islam. We do. There is a hierarchy of knowledge and everything. We do honor people of knowledge, and things like that. But there's no. You don't have this concept of speaking from the chair, like in the Catholic tradition, and this person is infallible. We don't have that in Islam.
Well, especially since a lot of them are starting to tumble off of those chairs, and right now, and it leaves a vacuum and it leaves a gap, and I think maybe one of the things that's happening in Muslim culture is, like you said, like there's this shift away from consistently developing your proficiency. And I'm not talking about when circumstances prevent that from happening. Sometimes you don't have the access. There's new Muslims every single day, and they don't have access to things. There are Muslims that just, because of where they live or a whole other bunch of circumstances, don't have access. But when you do have it, then avail yourself of it as much as you possibly can. And it's just a continual thing, at least to get to the point where, like you said, if it doesn't sound right, I'm not just going to accept it just because of who it's coming from. Because unless
you as a Muslim, you're not commanded to totally surrender your aql, your intellect, to anyone. I mean, as Muslims, we criticize the Christians for doing that. Same thing, right? In the Quran, Allah criticized, previous generations for taking their rabbis and everything as Lord's beside Allah. Again, now I'm not saying, of course, don't listen to scholars, and of course I'm not saying that. I'm a student of knowledge myself. I believe in, the importance of knowledge and relying upon those who know. With that being said, I also know not to surrender my soul and my intellect, to just, I'm another fallible person. You understand what I'm saying? So we have to have a medium. You know, this is umutawasita. You know, we're the middle community, the middle in everything. We're not extreme this way. We're not extreme that way. So a lot of the onus I do put, like I said, on like the laity, like we have to educate ourselves Islamically. We have to. Again, that's not to say that everyone is going to be a scholar, but there has to be some consistent, learning. Trying to do what we can to have the tools to access this knowledge. We have to. That's incumbent upon every single last person, every Muslim, as much as he or she can. And it's not fair to not do that, but then just criticize other people who we expect to just spoon feed us anything. And it all just spoon feed us and everything, and then they give us something we don't like, and it's we want to point the finger. Okay, but what are you doing to equip yourself, with the necessary knowledge so that you can navigate things also?
Do you think that there is a cultural distinction between this outlook of developing Islamic proficiency? Is it something that, as opposed to like grasping onto a scholar or two and kind of treating them, even though they themselves don't necessarily tell you to do so, but kind of treating them as like this infallible font
Mm-hmm.
of spiritual guidance and leaving it at that? Do you think that there's a cultural distinction, any kind of cultural distinctions, or is this just across the board in Muslim society?
I think that in Muslim society in general, there's a high level of respect and deference to people of knowledge. That's universal, I think, across any Muslim society. Um, the extent of which may vary from culture to culture, but it's there. No matter from my experience, in just about every Muslim, society, it's going to be there. The extent of which I said it differs.
Okay.
You know, um, I think really, in the African American community, we need to actually probably develop more of that. And I'll tell you why. I mean, we have so many brothers and sisters, you know, scholars or would-be scholars who, we don't. A lot of these issues can be addressed, but we don't pay attention to those people, those men and women who've already made the sacrifice and who already, and this I think is something particular to African Americans. We don't honor the men and women in our community who've already made, those sacrifices. Again, it's not a monolith. It's not just one person. There are many people, who are out there who have good information. They have sound intellect, sound knowledge, and everything, and we don't place any importance on, getting knowledge from these people. And I think within the Muslim tradition, I actually think that's a result of our traumatic experience in the church and dealing with like charlatan pastors and things like that. We just have an aversion within our particular culture to just following people and giving people their props, so to speak.
Well, I think it's that, but I also think that it's this whole idea of when you're talking about at the African American culture,
Mm.
the we've been force fed a faith, and
Mm.
in within that faith, there's been a lot of justification for our dehumanization and violence against us. And when
Mm.
you have, I'm talking about Christianity in particular. So when you
Mm.
have the that occur and it be propagated by people within your culture as well. So like you were mentioning, like the preachers, Christian preachers, and things like that. It's like that's a tainted pool. So because you're coming from that tainted pool, you have to resist against that ideology in order to find any liberation. I mean, you do have Black liberation theology where Black Christians did it. And I think that, but for Muslims, when you had the Black Muslim movement, a foundational part of it was, look at this, we're going to disassociate ourselves from that because that is not meant for us. What I find concerning is that in Muslim culture, especially now since the civil rights movement, and you had this opening up of the borders and you had this influx of immigrant Muslim populations that practice a lot of anti-blackness, racism, discrimination, and so now it's like, and they're trying to use Islam to do it because they're the ones that say, well, we have the clout, we have the credibility because we're the ones that are coming from the Muslim background, Blackie. African Americans are not going to sit by and drink that because African American Muslims completely disassociated themselves from an entire faith, not only because of the problem of the Trinity, but because of the utter oppression that was used in the name of that faith. And now here you come, just because you speak Arabic doesn't mean we're going to sit up here and drink that chai that is dehumanizing us. So that's the thing that concerns me. It's like they're using Islam, they're using their interpretation of Islam. They're trying to force this culture on people that are not going for it. They're just not going to go for it. So I think that's the reason why across the board there's this critical eye, and there's this hesitancy, this skepticism by African American Muslims. And I'm sorry, as an African American Muslim woman, you could just throw in all that misogyny that they're bringing with them. Okay. So it's just like when I hear people, sometimes I hear Black African American Muslim male scholarship, they say stuff that I'm just like, wait a minute. No, this sounds just like what white people are saying about me. This sounds just like what non-Black Muslims are saying about me. And they're using hadith to do it. Why are you doing this? And why are you saying this? And when it's broached, then we're attacked for it. So I think that's where it's coming from. We have this skepticism, rightfully so, because faith has been used to dehumanize and degrade us because of the color of our skin. And so now it's just like, if you're coming and you sound anything like that, that's just going to just put antennas up, and it's just going to be like, listen, wait a minute. No, I'm not down for that. I'm not going for that. It's not going to happen. So I think that's where that comes from.
I agree. A lot in regards to, a lot of the recent issues that I agree. You preach it to the choir. Like, I agree totally.
I know they're watching your stuff. I know.
Well,
the feed and everything, so I know.
No. What I was talking about was something different in how we just generally, not specifically, approach, a lot of our scholars, and I'm saying that as a person who's like, I bring it down a notch. Like, so for example, when I was in Egypt and everything, so many African American students like myself, we were all, we always were in financial constraints because we didn't have support, from the community back home. Whereas like a lot of Arab brothers, a lot of Indo-Pac brothers, like they were over there studying, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. The family, they're sponsoring them, they're sending them money and everything. And all of us, we had to work and still go to school, things like that. So I was speaking about it from that perspective. What you're talking about, like you said, in regards to having skepticism over how the religion is being, like you said, taught, especially if it's sounding anything similar to, so I was just having the same discussion with a friend of mine yesterday. We were talking about the Nation the Nation of Islam theology, right? And I said that one of the biggest, in my opinion, flaws in their theology is their denial of the afterlife, because if the slave master, if Master Johnson or Master Jones, whatever, if there's no afterlife and he got off just scot free, like I got a problem with that, right? These are people who enslaved, tortured, dehumanized, millions of people. He just gets to die and that's it. Like there's no justice. I have a problem with that, right? And so my friend, he said, and I know this, he said, well, that was just a knee-jerk response to how Christianity was taught to us. So don't resist, just accept your lot in this life. You'll get yours in the hereafter, right? So don't fight us. Don't worry about Jim Crow. You'll get yours in hereafter. This as a knee-jerk reaction. You got the Nation of Islam come along. You know what? That whole stuff about the afterlife is totally, it's totally. There's no afterlife. You get yours now. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things about the Nation of Islam's theology.
No, I was using it actually to agree with what you were saying about how like this knee-jerk response and skepticism to how religion is being taught to us. I was just using that in an Islamic context because you were talking about it.
Isn't there a way to? I think that that one of the distinctions about African American Muslim culture, not only that it's so new, is that I think that skepticism is something that's to be valued, because even just looking recently at what has happened with scholarship, American Muslim scholarship in particular, and like these scholars that have like these huge followings, which includes African Americans, but these huge followings, and and it's revealed, which it shouldn't be, but it's revealed that they're human. Like that shouldn't be a revelation to anyone that they're human. And so then there's like this huge thing that occurs, and this huge vacuum that occurs, and all of this infighting, all of this fighting and everything like that. And I think that if African American Muslims have not, for the most part, followed that concept of like revering, I think we kind of like we started it, but we pulled back from it. And I think that's something to be valued, because across in American Muslim culture in general, there's this huge problem with over revering and over listening, and just kind of taking anything that anyone says off the top of their head as gospel, as Muslim gospel.
I think we have healthy skepticism is good, and we should always have that, as Muslims. And I think that we should just also put things in its proper context, right? So I'm not gonna go to a hadith or a fiqh scholar and and ask them for advice on like how to fix my car or something, right? Just because a person is an expert in one particular field does not mean that that person is an expert in everything. In this, I don't know. I really think we got that mentality like from like the immigrant community, right? So in the immigrant community, I don't know if you've seen this, but like if a person is a medical doctor, he's somehow an imam, he's somehow a sheikh. He leads the prayer in the masjid. What's his qualification? Oh, he's a cardiologist. Okay.
I think they have that whole role of the imam, okay, that's supposed to know all about everything, and they just simply don't. I mean, it's like a lot of times it's like someone that has studied and specialized, because when you look at the scholarship and the way that the Islamic scholarship process, there's always specialization. So you're going to reach a certain level, and then you're going to have to like narrow that down into a specialization, and that's what that's what you become
exactly
master at, type of thing. But they take these people and they put them in this broad position of imam, and they're supposed to know everything. And what's even worse is that they pick them up out of their culture and they drop them in American Muslim culture, which, I mean, come on. Are you for real? Talking about a fish out of water and not understanding anything about what's going on. It's like they've been living in this bubble of scholarship, and now they're here, and here's this whole can of worms. They're not a product of the society themselves, oftentimes. If they are a product of the society, they haven't been able to explore other things that they need to know. Okay, because it's like you can study fiqh, you can become a faqih, but that doesn't mean that you're experienced in handling domestic violence. Okay, in Islamic context.
Even in the fiqh tradition, this is a lot of people understand. So, and this is in our tradition. So traditionally, if a scholar was from another land, he or she cannot issue fatwas or legal opinions about issues in a place where they didn't live and they didn't have any knowledge of.
Oh wow. Did they do that to Albani? They used to come to him and ask him questions. He would answer. They go run it off. He
No,
said,
I'm not only that.
telling him that they were going to be using it all the way in this whole other context.
Yeah, I give you a perfect example, and I use this a lot. And this happened with my alma mater, of course, is Azhar. I love Azhar. There was an Azhari scholar. This was in Virginia, and there was an issue where the warden of a prison, he asked this imam, a respected scholar. I'm not going to say his name. He asked him, did the prison have to provide Friday prayers for the Muslim inmates? And the imam said no. Traditionally, there's nothing wrong with what he said. Why? Because Juma is not obligated upon a person who doesn't have his freedom. Right? So like slaves, and that would be the analogy of a person who doesn't have their freedom. Juma is not an obligation upon them. So the Lord said, okay, so he stopped the Muslims from having Friday prayer in the jail. What the Imam said was technically true, but not in this context. Why? We have something which is something called what's that statute? Reasonable accommodation, where actually the institution has to provide religious services for all inmates as long as there's no security risks and things like this. This is the law here. Of course, the imam was not familiar with that. He's just going off of this, the traditional fiqh text which he studied at Azhar and everything, and he said something which was erroneous in this context. Traditionally, that would be frowned upon. Someone not being culturally inclined and in tune, giving religious opinions about a place and about a people which they had no knowledge of, even if they were scholars. So we don't even have this in the Islamic tradition. Again, a lot of this is culture. Like the one-stop shop. I was reading something the other day. A sheikh said, he said, listen, if someone comes to you and they have like depression issues, don't tell them to just read the Quran. Yeah, read the Quran, but direct them to a person trained in mental health.
Yeah, I almost died because of that. Honestly, I almost died. I was going through postpartum depression, and I was told to do that. And then my husband came home and saw me with the knife, and he was just like, yeah, no, we're not going to just stick with that. We're going to try to get you some help." So, and that's only because he works in social work. So it's like, if you don't have that, if the breadth of knowledge of Muslims is not valued and utilized to its optimum efficiency, then you're going to have all these problems that exist. Okay. And like you said, you have to go out and you have to learn, and as much as you possibly can learn, which I'm so glad that you did. And I'm so glad that Black Muslims, and I'm just going to be honest about it, because I've spent the last 28 years, a little less than 28 years, because not having access to stuff like this. I think it's amazing how there is like this whole filter of knowledge that we don't know. We don't know these things. We're not going to find out these things because we don't even get to choose what gets translated, what doesn't get translated. It takes someone to kind of say, listen, you know what, this is really important work. This needs to be translated. Mm-hmm. I always think of how, and Habiba Kande pointed that out too. Like how many people will sit in Azhar University, Medina University, Mecca University, and read this problematic stuff, and they just keep on going by it, and that's it. And they get their degrees and everything like that, and it doesn't affect any kind of change or any kind of discussion inside those institutions, and definitely not outside those institutions. So when we have work like yours, with a Muslim that's actually decided, and Dawood Walid, who have said, "Listen, we can use this scholarship to open up these discussions because this is what's going on in the society. These are the problems that are going on in the society. Black erasure is a huge problem in Muslim culture, and even to the point where, honestly, I would assert with some confidence that the majority of Black Muslims are trained, and non-Black Muslims are trained not to think of Blackness when you're thinking about Islamic history, especially the Sahaba. We know, like, usually it's stuck to Bilal, then it went up a notch, and they included Sumaya. But in your book, you include Ali ibn Abi Talib.
Nah.
You would have a whole bunch of people mad.
Hey, they're really gonna be mad. Inshallah, in February we got part 2 coming out, which is dealing with only the Black imams from Ahl al-Bayt, the Black imams from the family of the Prophet.
I hope you got a Kevlar vest.
So if they're not mad, just wait.
Abu Bakr, you mentioned Abu Bakr, and I just was like, hold up, wait a second. Go back, and I myself as a Black person, because I've been trained this way, like there's a cognitive dissonance. I can't imagine that. My brain has got to wrap around that concept. I remember when Omar Suleiman mentioned Musa, the Prophet Musa, as being Black, and he said, and he made perfect sense. He said, if Allah sent a prophet to every people, do you think they were all Arabs? The prophet from among the people to them. Do you really think they were all Arabs? But that's what we're trained. We're trained inside of Muslim culture to kind of think of this passing white Arab archetype when it comes to Islam. It's just like we just really just directly correlated. So when you imagine them, that's what you think of them all as these really passing white, not just even tan, like they got it like white Arabs. That's the way the Prophet ﷺ is depicted, and a lot of Persian art and Iranian art and Turkish art is like, and like this development of like this whitewashing, actual whitewashing of people that mean so much to the Muslim identity and the faith.
I mean, you seen the movie The Message, right?
Yeah. Were you like, oh well, that's wrong. That's wrong.
No, I'm saying
Sumaya was white. I'm sorry.
Sumaya was, Jaffa was. The only Black spot in there was Bilal, and not only that, but they made him like extremely Black, like
black.
Which is nothing wrong with it, but my thing is, like, when we read the actual description of Sayyidina Bilal and we read the actual description of Sayyidina Ali, it's exactly the same. Not like the wording, Adam Shadid al-Udma. It's exact. It means Black, not only Black but extremely Black. Okay, so if you're gonna depict Bilal that way, how come you didn't depict? Well, they didn't depict Sayyidina Ali in the movie, but they did depict his brother Jafar. And that movie, by the way, was Azhar gave it the okay. Go figure. But
They had Omar too.
huh?
Did you see the one Omar?
No, I didn't see that one yet. I didn't
Yeah,
see.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was
So
whitewashing there too. You
yeah.
know,
So
and you
yeah.
would
I
think
mean.
Muslims would know better. That's the thing. It's because, like, listen, they, like the broader society whitewashes ancient Egypt all the time.
Mm,
It just, it's
mm,
like they were like, Yul Brynner was a pharaoh. It was just like, really,
mm.
huh? And look at Elizabeth Taylor was Cleopatra. Oh, because she was Greek. No, she was part Greek. She was full.
This is the thing though. Um, whenever black people, black Muslims assert their blackness and their Islamicness, whatever, we're always told, there's no, to basically just forego our blackness and just be Muslim. But
Yeah,
everyone else, they can celebrate their
a Daisy background.
yeah, their background and all that, their scholars and their tradition and everything. But when it comes to us, no, we're just Muslim. And unfortunately, you have a lot of black Muslims who fall into this. I mean, I've had, a lot of pushback from black Muslims. Brother, we're just Muslim.
Yeah,
You know,
Islam doesn't see color.
yeah, right. There's no color in Islam. Okay,
Why are you
well,
always bringing up race? Why has it got to be about race? That's a huge problem, and
mm,
I think that African American Muslims, and I'm hoping, like, uh, because of the strong anti-racist tendencies of African American Muslims, Caribbean Muslims, uh, and and I think that a lot of the British Muslims, I'm just really kind of thinking of a Western context right now. A lot of hopefully a lot of British Muslims will now kind of see, because now you got that being black and Muslim in Britain. Now when
mm,
they have that, was just like, wait a second, hold up, wait a second.
mm,
I this you can't disregard this, because it's who we are, and it affects us. It affects us inside our faith, and it affects us outside of our faith, and we need to explore that. So I think that
mm.
that's something that's really interesting that is happening in Western Muslim culture, and I think because African American Muslims saw utilized Islam as not just a deen, but also
Mm,
a source of liberation. That
mm,
there's I think that that spans out now because of the influence of famous African American Muslims like Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X. There were some that in recent history that it kind of come out. I'm hoping that they'll come back, type of thing. I'm praying for a couple of them. I'm like, please come back, because you were phenomenal. And so, and instead of like kind of like trying to act like this is not a thing, because
mm.
it definitely is a thing, and how it affects us inside and outside the faith is definitely a thing. And having works like this is very, very important
Thank you.
in us feeling our significance and our humanity, because it's taken away from us. Non-black Muslims have taken it away from us, and it's just
Mm,
like, step back and let us explore this. And if you're giving pushback, that's because you have a problem with blackness. I'm just going to be honest about it, because
mm.
you wouldn't care that black Muslims are celebrating black Muslim culture and black Muslim scholarship. You really wouldn't care, because you do it for your own backgrounds and ethnicities and races. So just by virtue of the fact that you're pushing back on it, I don't care if you're a layperson or a scholar that's been studying abroad for all of these years and you can speak fluent Arabic and everything like that. If you're telling me there's something wrong with me exploring my blackness and my faith, then that's because you have a problem with my blackness. Period.
Mm.
So I think that it works like yours are very, very important. I can't wait for part two.
Uh, February, inshallah.
In February? Okay, so you're gonna
Yeah,
come back after I read part two?
yeah, inshallah.
Oh, awesome, excellent. Well, Jazakallah khairan. I took up a lot of your time, but this was a really, really fascinating discussion. I encourage everyone, black, non-black, please pick up Centering Black Narratives. It's a really excellent book. It's very thought-provoking. And it also, say something like, with your messy hair, it also encourages us as Muslims to really appreciate the dynamics of the way Allah is, what the attributes that Allah has given us, and the humanity that He's given us in those attributes. So Jazakallah khairan and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.